talking to us about CCM and how they integrated it at the University of Waterloo.
Thank you. Good morning. At least I'm not talking to an empty room, which is what I sort of pictured when I came in here and there was nobody here. Okay, I'll just talk to the online folks. My name's John Mayle. I work at the University of Waterloo. To give you a quick background on who I am, before the last year, I was a consultant doing System Center Configuration Manager. I did about 10 years on it in the private sector. The smallest deployment I've done was 500 odd machines for an engineering firm spread throughout the country. The largest was for one of the major banks. That was 110,000 desktops spread throughout North America. One of the things that I want to stress with this product is how expandable it is. Because given those two scenarios, it was the same software, the same feature set. We just had more servers is essentially the only difference. So what I'm going to do today is sort of go over what it looked like when I got to the university a year ago, what we were doing for things like software distribution and so on, and what we're doing now in my little part of the world that we're hoping to expand to the rest of the university as we get some of the hurdles out of the way. So the first thing is the major features of SCCM, the ones we are currently using every day. First one is software deployment. This is pretty much our bread and butter. This is what it was built for, along with other things, but this is where we spend most of our time. I have a couple of people that we've trained to use the software as well. They're doing software deployments now all the time, and I'm using the management console to do other things, but software deployment is the first thing we started doing. There we go. Software updates. Now this is also part of the core functionality. We're using this for a small number of machines currently because we're actually sort of transitioning over from our SUS server. Reporting, this is the first thing that people ask for when we get it installed. When I was doing this as a consultant, you'd have a project sponsor, the person who's saying, okay, here's the money, go make it happen. And then the technical people who I'd work with. The reporting was the first thing the project sponsor wanted. Because after we get the client deployed, after we get it out in the field and start getting information, they want to actually see what it is they've got. What software is installed, what the servers look like, all the inventory, hardware and software, all that information becomes available generally within a day of installing the client. And that's one of the first things they wanted to see. Operating system deployment is what we're doing mostly right now. We're actually deploying the OS to the Podium computers, what would be the equivalent of this machine here. We're doing that right now. We actually just finished doing all of ours. We're gearing up to replace them again at the end of the month and then again in September. This is actually one of the places where SCCM really shines. And time permitting, it's not really a demo, but I've got my live environment online, and I can show you one of our task sequences that we're using to deploy the OS, deploy applications, deploy updates, things like that, and some of the intelligence that's built into this software right out of the box. And then collections. This isn't really a feature, although it's something we use all the time for every one of these pieces. So we group computers together by using collections. What I wanted to stress and what I want to actually show you is how versatile these collections are and the features of the collections themselves. You can build a collection out of virtually anything. Any kind of criteria that you can imagine on a computer, we can build a collection out of, and that's why they're so handy. And then finally, the inventory. Now this is hardware and software, but SCCM has an AI or asset intelligence piece built into it. And I'll give you an example of why that's handy. This is a great thing to have if you just want to know what's in your environment. We install the client, the inventory takes place automatically, and then we start getting data. And one of the first things that you can do is look and see what's out there. So it's really interesting to see, how many line wires we've got out there in any given day. So the first thing is software deployment. This is what it looked like when I arrived. And again, this is still true in parts of the university, most of the university as a matter of fact, but as we're moving forward, we're sort of transitioning. So the first thing, GPOs and in-house applications used for most software deployment. Is anybody else using GPOs to deploy software? Good, okay. So we are using that quite a bit still. One of the biggest failures that we've got, one of the biggest problems we have with that is we have no idea whether they work. Because when you deploy a piece of software, the group policy, it just sort of deploys. We don't know if it worked. We don't know if it didn't work. We don't know how many of the 5,000 machines that we just deployed to actually installed properly. And to give you an idea of what this did for us, one of the first things we did was replace the Adobe Flash Player group policy with SCCM. And then we started running some reports. Before we actually pushed out the software, we got this report back. We had something like 50 different versions of Adobe out there because it had been pushed out consistently. We've been updating it. About half the machines weren't updating, but we had no idea. So they were running Flash. They were just running around from 3 years ago, 2 years ago, things like that. So we used this as a basis and said, okay, first thing we've got to do is get rid of the old Adobes out there. We wrote uninstaller scripts. We pushed those out through SCCM to uninstall Adobe Flash first. Then we pushed out the new Flash. We're now up to about 95% of all running the same version. No clear ownership or maintenance of the GPOs. One of the problems you have with this, and I don't know what it's like in the other environments, but not every GPO comes through the same person. We have multiple people creating multiple GPOs in multiple departments, which means that any given computer looks like Frankenstein. It's got this GPO from here, this GPO from here, and the podium computers especially, because they're used in all faculties, have multiple GPOs from multiple faculties applied to them. And what we end up with there is old versions of software, software that we don't really need, things like that. And then when we go to update a piece of software, whose GPO is it? We're not really sure because it's just there. So we have to track it down, find the person who wrote it and update it. So sometimes the GPO itself is the problem. The more software we have, the more GPOs. In some areas, we do have 30 plus group policy objects applying to a single computer, all installing software. So at boot time, this can slow things down considerably, especially if it's a brand new image machine. In some areas, had a single GPO deploying 30 applications in one. And that was sort of conglomeration of departments all getting together in one group policy. Again, what we ended up with is just a mishmash of software installed on multiple computers and no real clear single way of cleaning it up. Because if a group policy has 30 objects in it, if we alter one of them, well, that policy might be in use somewhere else and they say, hey, you can't play with our policy, you're gonna have to create another one. And this just keeps on going. So with SCCM, first thing we've got is full reporting on the deployment status. When we push out software, we get a report that says whether it worked or not. Which machines worked, which machines didn't. And when they fail, I can go into an individual report for an individual machine and find out why. There are a lot of tools, third party for Configuration Manager, that are free, that allow you to delve really deeply into the clients and why they failed. I really recommend you use these things. Now, in interest of full disclosure, we're currently running SCCM 2007. We also have 2012 set up. We're in the middle of migrating them. But we use 2007 so much, it's actually kind of hard to get a window where I can bring it down, spend a week getting everything migrated, testing, make sure everything's good and bring it back up again, because we're pushing out software all the time. But these features are the same between the two versions. I will refer to 2012 though, in certain parts to show you the differences. Centralized management and control of the application. So we've got one pane of glass. Instead of the applications that we have now to push out software that have this console, this console, this console, we have one console that we do everything through. It allows me to see all the application deployment status. It allows me to push software out. I can separate management in that console and delegate it to groups of people so that they can actually manage their own areas. And that's actually something we get requested a lot. One tool for all software packages. So if you're using group policies, they're limited to MSIs. We can push out anything. EXEs, BATs, COMs, anything you want. And as a matter of fact, we do that a lot. The guy in the room beside me, Mike, he writes a lot of batch scripts to do complicated installs that have to do really odd stuff. We just write a batch, we push it out. Or using task sequences, and again, I'll try and find some time to show this to you towards the end. We can put in step by step by step by step for one piece of software. So if the first thing is we have to install a prerequisite, we put that in. Or we can check and see if it's there, and if it's not there, we install it. Then we install a second one, do a reboot, install another piece, do another reboot, do a check on a file. If the version of the file isn't right, we install a piece of software. The task sequences are really, really useful. And they're not just for operating system deployment, we use them for software deployment all the time. No reboot. So for group policies, we generally have to reboot to make them take effect. Here we just push the software out. Unless the software requires it, of course. But we can just get a request for a piece of software. I had this recently, Visio 2013, somebody wanted it. We just pushed it out. They got it about 15 minutes later, and everybody's happy, no reboots, no interruption of the client. The task sequences are also very handy for software deployment. If you have a package for a faculty, a certain set of software groups that you push out to the same faculty all the time, we can just create a task sequence that says this software 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and keep it. So this is the engineering software package. And every time they need a package on a new machine, we just push out the package. It can test to see if some of the packages are already there, and if they are, just skip it. And one of the nice things about task sequences is you can build in all kinds of intelligence. If this is true, do this. If this isn't true, do this. Is anybody using the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, the MDT? Excellent, you'll love this. So we integrate that in. If you have MDT task sequences, you can't actually take it and bring it in directly, but you can copy it and bring it in the steps individually. And that feature allows you to do a lot more configuration within a task sequence. And again, I'll try and show this to you a little bit later on. We have training scheduled for some of our staff so that we can show them how to use it, because when I took the job, they promised me world domination, and then they backed off on that about 15 minutes in and said, okay, you can't really run the place. And then they said, okay, each faculty is going to have their own way of doing things. And we can't just say to them, this is how it's going to be from on high. So what we're going to do is set up training internally for faculty and tech staff to allow them to use it in their own departments, push out their own software, run their own reports, customize their own reports. Because generally speaking, I don't want somebody from engineering to see all the computers or all the things that are going on with computers in, say, math. That could get ugly. So what we want to do is just give them control and view into their own computers. And then reducing or removing the software installation GPOs. I mean, that's the goal. And we're actually on schedule right now to achieve that for the podiums by the end of this month. Software updates. Right now we use a SUS server. The thing about SCCM is it uses SUS as a back end. So there's not a lot of difference in the actual functionality at the back end. But at the front end, first of all, we can target the installs of the patches. We don't just say, here's the patches, come and get them. We can target the installs to groups of computers, faculties, times. We can set it to go at midnight on a Friday. We can tell them to reboot or not reboot. Templates, which means when I push out a patch package, I can say, okay, for our servers, we always do this. We don't reboot unless we hit a maintenance window. We don't do this during work hours. That kind of thing. So I can set that up in advance, and every time we push out to servers a patch package, it will observe those rules and not install till, say, Friday at midnight. No reboots until, say, Friday at midnight. And that is also something we can work with called maintenance windows. In the collections themselves, there is a setting called a maintenance window. And we set that up when we set up the collection, and it basically says, don't do anything to these computers unless it hits this schedule. Like group policies, kind of like shielding it from whatever's coming down, but you can override those maintenance windows. If we get an emergency patch and we need to push it out to our servers right away, if we've got a maintenance window set up, we can push through that and install right now. Reporting, as I said, this is one of the first things we get asked about. And the good thing is, right out of the box, with a whole pile of pre-canned reports. Right now, or when I got there, and actually this is true right now, each of the tools that we have, and we have lots, creates its own report. So what you're actually going to see in that report is what the person who wrote the tool thought was the information that was important. Maybe, maybe not. Probably to the person who wrote it, it's great, but if we need something else, we're kind of stuck. No central reporting structure, so there's no one place to go for reports. They're all spread out over each tool. In order to get this data, you run this tool or go to this web address and so on. No insight into the package deployment, so no matter what we had, we have no insight into what our packages are doing. And no single backend database. One of the things that we use in Configuration Manager a lot, we utilize the fact that all of the data, all of it, goes into one database that is queryable. The structure of the database was published by Microsoft a few years ago. They haven't published the 2012 one yet, but they will. And in that case, you are free to take all this data and turn it into any kind of report you want. You just need somebody who knows how to get the data and turn it into a report. That ain't me. I made that quite clear. I am not that guy. But somebody who really knows their way around SQL tables and reporting, because the back end on this is SQL reporting services. That's what we use to generate reports. If they know how to use SQL reporting services, they can turn this into anything they want. So now with SCCM, 541 pre-made reports in 2012. So right out of the box, those reports are populated and ready to run. One of the things that you can do is take a pre-made report, copy it, and then modify it to your needs. So you don't really need to reinvent the wheel every time you need a new report. You can just take an existing report and say, you know what, I want this to always run on this collection. So I've got a collection of computers that are in a faculty. I want to give this report to the people in that faculty. I can take that report, point it at their computers so it can't be changed, and then say, here's your report, and let them run it all the time. They can subscribe to them as well and get them emailed to them. Full support for custom reports through the report builder. It's web-based, so I don't need to install anything for them to access the reports. They just go to a URL. We use Windows security to let them in. And then real-time status of the software deployments. We assign the permissions on them to create, edit, and view. So some people, no problem, they can view reports. You're not allowed to touch them. Other people are allowed to touch them, so they get the edit functionality. But bear in mind, like I say, the database is fully queryable in read-only mode. So we can say, just let them read the data, turn into any report they want, but just don't let them edit it. Really don't let them edit it. Operating system deployment is where we're spending a lot of our time right now. This is one of the features that I've used a lot over the years, and one of the features that allows you to do the most configuration. So coming in, it was Ghost or ImageX, required a physical visit, so a full touch. Generally speaking, what they would do, if they had a bad PC or if they were imaging, they'd bring it into a lab, image it, put a spare out there, and then take the spare and replace it. So we had a sort of a physical thing going on with these machines. Post-install logon to initiate the GPO deployment. So we'd install the image, but then there was all these GPOs that had to come down and do their work. So we'd have to log on or reboot or do something to make those GPOs actually work. And then last, this was the part that we really didn't like. If the image was a little older, there's a whole pile of Windows updates that have to come down. So if you've got a bad day where both the GPOs and the updates had to come down, you were a good hour and a half before you could use that computer. And if we were replacing one in place, that meant it was essentially out of business until everything was finished. Now what we do with SCCM, we use the operating system deployment piece. We have integrated the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, which gives us additional functionality. And it's essentially no touch or light touch. No touch is going to be where it's in place, it's got the client installed, and we need to image it. We can advertise an image to the machine, and it will image at the time of our choosing. We can do it during a lunch hour. We can do it overnight. Most of the ones we've been doing recently were on Friday nights because we wanted them to image, and then we could go in and look at the reports, make sure everything's good for Monday morning. But if the procedure is down, you know everything's good, you can image a whole lab on a Monday night, come in Tuesday morning, everybody's ready to work. And this means that we can actually do it offline, no disruption, no physically visiting the computers. So we've got multiple task sequences. Does anybody know what I'm talking about when I say task sequences? Has anybody seen one? No? Okay, I'm gonna show you one in a second, and then I'll show you one live. I'll make sure we cover that. The Microsoft Deployment Toolkit integration gives me options. What that means is I can run a group of steps on a computer. This group of steps will detect if it's a laptop and do one thing, if it's a desktop, do another thing, if it's a server, do another thing. So we can set it up in advance for virtually any kind of configuration or scenario, and then just run this one task sequence for all computers. And essentially, that's where it was when I was at the bank. We had 110,000 computers. We had one task sequence, and it would just run and say, it's one of these, do this, it's one of these, do this. And that means that you don't have to maintain one for every single area. You can if you want, but we would just have one. Pixie boot and USB boot. So even if it's a dead machine or a bare metal install, you just power it up, the imaging process takes over and images the machine in place. And the imaging machine process installs the OS, puts on the software updates, and the applications all in one sequence. We keep the image as up to date as we can so the updates are minimal, but then the applications go on at the end. The good thing about this is if we've got an update to an application, if it's a thick image, you got to kind of recreate the image. In this case, it's a thin image. There's almost nothing on it. And what we do is, if I've got an update to an application, I can just go in, update the application in the task sequence, and then when it runs, it'll just get the updated one. We don't have to change anything. We can just update the packages, and then every time a machine gets installed, it'll get updated. We can do a lab or a building at one time. We can do as many as your network infrastructure can handle. One of the things I usually get asked is, how many can you do at once? The answer is, how good's your disk, how good's your network? I mean, ultimately, you can do 1,000 of them at once as long as the machines can handle it. And the answer to the other question that I usually get asked is, how many servers do you need? We have 6,000 odd machines. We have one server, and we're not going to 2 unless we have to. This server is not currently doing all 6,000, but it could easily. Because ultimately in SCCM, all the data ends up in one server anyway. It all depends on your infrastructure, but it doesn't need a big infrastructure. You can do all of this with one server. And then standing advertisements, this is something the tech guys really like. What that means is I can have a computer, or all the computers, for example. In the control panel is an area you can go into and initiate an imaging sequence manually. So if a tech guy needs to image a machine, he doesn't have to pick it up, carry it back to the lab. He doesn't need to call and say, can you please set in place an image on this machine? He clicks a button and it starts imaging right there. And these are in an area of the control panel that are normally not accessible to our users. I mean, it depends if you give your users local admin, you're pretty much hooked anyway. But if you don't have local admin, you can't get to this area of the control panel. So I'm just going to really quickly go over how this works, and I'm going to skip all the graphics. But essentially for us, when we do an image deployment, all of these steps are steps in a task sequence. So each one of these that you see is a line in a task sequence, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. So in an old OS, if it's a standing imaging, we would reboot to PE, save the settings, and start the deployment. If it's a bare metal machine, we'd boot into Pixie or a USB key. The keys are really handy too. Those are very good for the tech guys. We can password protect them so that they're the only ones who can use them, and they can use it to image a machine offline. It doesn't have to have network connectivity. Everything's on the key. Or we can use the key in place of Pixie. So if Pixie's not working, you boot to the key, it connects over the network to the server and starts the process. It's a very lightweight key. Adding the device drivers and so on, install everything, install the software updates, restore the user state in settings, and then we're back to where we were. And there's several ways we can do that. These are the scenarios that we cover. Virtually anything that you can think of in a machine, whether it's a wipe and load or a side-by-side. You can set up associations, by the way. We don't do this, but you can, whereas you have a machine and you say, I'm going to replace this machine with this machine. If you're going to do that, what you're essentially saying to it is, take everything that's on this machine, put it on this machine. And it will do an association and allow you to clone the machines virtually. So all the user state stuff would get backed up from the one machine, then the image applied, then put back in place on the new machine. So it knows enough to relate the two. This is what a task sequence looks like. This is one of, this one has actually gotten a lot longer since I did. This is actually a screenshot from one of the ones that we have. The great things about these, you don't have to build them yourself. The wizard builds them. So you say to it, I want to do this, and it builds you a task sequence. And all that happens is they get longer and longer and longer as you're installing more software. So you can see up at the top, where you start in Windows PE, use the Toolkit package, that's the MDT integration piece, partition the disk, apply the operating system, then we do things like drivers. I've got 8 driver packages here. The task sequence, as it's running, looks at the machine, it'll query the WMI, and it'll say, based on whatever string I get back, perform something. So in this case, each one of these has a query behind it that says, query the WMI, look for the model number. If the model number matches an M90, then install the M90 drivers, and all the rest of these steps get ignored. So I can have all my driver packages accounted for in the one task sequence. I don't need a separate one for each model. This just means one task sequence. Again, I can push out to any machine we've got and the drivers get installed automatically. One of the other things you can do with these is with the MDT integration, you can stage servers. So if you need a server that's got IIS in it and other things, other configurations, you actually install it, or sorry, you set up the steps, and then it'll have things that say install IIS, do this, do this, do this. And it essentially gives you the screen that you would use to install features on a server, and you can check off the features and it'll install all of those for you. Then you get down to the OS and stools. I'll show you a live one in a second. Inventory So when we first began, inventory was there, but it was a little bit decentralized. Again, we have multiple tools, no intelligence built into it. So there was nothing in there that said, this is what we have. It was just line after line, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. Now, we have asset intelligence, and I'll show you the next slide, I'll show you what that means. Full inventory of hardware, software collected from each machine. So when the client gets installed, it does an inventory of everything. Software and hardware initially, all the data comes in, and you can use some pre-made reports that allow you to see what's going on with the machine. And I use this stuff all the time. I get calls, like I got a call from security the other day saying, we've got a machine, it was hacked into. Do we have any idea when this version of Java was installed on it? And I was able to go back into the inventory for that machine about 6 months and discover that the version that they had on it was faulty. They weren't able to protect themselves. And so we knew how it got exploited. Most use applications, we can use the inventory mechanism to figure out what applications are actually getting used so we can make purchasing decisions. Things like, do we really need 10 copies of this? One of the other things we're currently working on is a software library purchasing page, so they can go to the page, purchase a piece of software, and in the back end, SCCM will automatically deploy the software to them once they buy it. This is what the asset intelligence piece does. That's how many names Microsoft is known by in publishers. If you go in just by publishers in the asset intelligence piece, there'd be 72 entries for Microsoft. The asset intelligence mechanism would reduce this to 1 entry. It would be Microsoft. And that's something, this actually takes people to do this. They have people back at Microsoft who do nothing but look over publisher names and go, oh, that's the same one, that's the same one, that's the same one. And when you inventory this data, if you want, gets uploaded to the Microsoft servers, just the names. They turn it into common sense and sort of fill out the fields for you. It isn't interactive, but it allows you to actually submit publishers too. If you've got a whole pile of them that you think are the same, you can submit it through the console, and then it'll come back in a week or so and say, approved, published, whatever. Now the second last piece, I like the transitions, I play with those when I get bored. The collections, the last piece, this is sort of the heart of the system. This is what we use for everything. When we deploy software, when we deploy patches, when we deploy operating systems, we use collections. They're infinitely flexible, meaning you can create a collection out of anything. So if you've got a bunch of machines and they're somehow similar, but you can't think of how to put them all in one place, I guarantee you there's something in the collection data that you can use to turn them all into one collection and deploy software to them. The other thing that we have is something called collection variables. These are very handy. We can include and exclude other collections. So I can say, for example, Adobe. Everybody likes deploying Adobe, right? It goes out smoothly every single time. We do it once a day. So what that means is I use a lot of Adobe collections. I can include a collection of Adobe Pro with a collection of Adobe Reader. We get a lot of feedback on stuff like this. If we install Reader and then install Pro, if we install Pro and then install Reader, Reader takes over opening PDF documents. The Pro people don't like that. So we have to make sure that doesn't happen. So we've got a collection of both of them, and I've got intelligence built in that says, if it's a Reader person, install Reader. If it's a Pro person, install Pro. Don't mix them up. And I'll show you what that looks like, because I'm going to try and get to that. They asked me to do some recommendations at the end. I'll do as quick as I can. Get management backing. If something goes wrong, you really do need the manager behind you to say, this is how we're doing it now. I've got all kinds of stories about this, but trust me, this is very important. Plan your deployments and test everything. So, and I mean that. If an installation works fine when you run it, that doesn't mean it's going to work fine when you deploy it. Test it through SCCM and make sure it works before you push it out to 4,000 machines. Make full use of the collections, so make sure you use them. Create lots of them. That's what they're there for. Learn which log files to read. There's a ton of them, but some of them are very handy. Exec manager, CCM exec, there's all kinds of them. And they're fully documented on which ones to read. Use CM trace. I don't know if you guys have heard of this. It's called Trace 32 in the 2007 version. In the 2012 version, it's called CM trace. Even if you're not running Configuration Manager, you should get this tool. It's the best log file viewer out there. It's like tail in the Unix world. It's great. It keeps the log file scrolling. You can highlight stuff. It highlights errors and everything. It's really handy. Integrate the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit if you can. It's very handy. It's free. It does not screw anything up. At least it hasn't for me. And it's quite straightforward to integrate. There's literally right-click, integrate, and it's done. And then use the tools. There's lots of them out there. These are called the right-click tools. Google them and you'll find them. Client Center, another piece of software that some guy wrote that I use every single day. Copy tool, things like that. Look for these. If you're using Configuration Manager, there are a ton of tools out there that you can use to make your life better. Delegate. I had to learn this lesson. I didn't want to, but I did. So you got to get other people to be able to do things for you, because I'm telling you, after a while, pushing out software gets old. And other people can do it, it's no problem, but there's a whole whack of things that I'm currently trying to get done right now. I'm finally able to move on to them now because I've got a few other people doing the software deployments and the software updates and things like that. Make sure that they can actually do that. Now, that's the slideshow, but I have a demo. I don't know, what am I looking at for time? I'm okay? Any questions quickly while I pop up the demo? Yeah.
Oliver from York University. You have only one site. Right?
Yes.
I mean, one central site.
Yes.
You basically delegate the roles to faculty units.
We're not yet. We're going to. So that's. Yeah.
Please repeat the question.
Oh, sure. What he was asking is, are we going to delegate, or have we delegated roles to other faculty from the single site? We haven't, but we're going to. That's actually part of the training. We have some faculties already using the software, but it's not a small piece of software, and you can't just give them the console and say, have at it, right? I mean, that could be really bad. So what we're doing is, that's what the training is for. I'm going to be running some sessions internally where we're going to give them a console, show them how it works, get them to do some deployments, and then sort of let them do their own deployments with their own software. But most of the stuff that they're going to see is coming down from the central site. So even though I may have like an environment, for example, they have their own applications, but those applications are generally introduced at the top of the tree, because that way we can take it, test it, make sure it works in SCCM, and then they can go and use it, because they shouldn't be bothered with that stuff.
You have a question on that?
Yeah.
What about Macs and Linux machines?
SCCM 2012 SP1 provides support for Macs and Linux. I'm actually quite surprised at the number of people running Macs who are interested in this. Now, the full suite of what we're going to do is not in that, right? The full suite of the features that I just showed you aren't supported by the Mac and Linux clients, but the basic ones are: software deployment, updates, things like that. Let's see.
Does SCCM
Manage third-party software?
Deploying third-party software?
Oh yeah, no problem.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. One of the things, usually, let me just get my screen back here. Usually, what we have to do some configuration for is to patch third-party software. So if you want to patch, for example, if you want to patch Adobe Player or something like that, because the Adobe updates come out regularly, there is a third, it's not a third-party piece. It's made by Microsoft called SCCM. It's a plugin that allows you to turn those updates into a package that Configuration Manager understands and will deploy. So you can actually use the same mechanism to patch all of your updates. The only thing is you have to run them through SCCM first. And it's actually straightforward, and it's a free piece of software. So let's just see. I think somebody logged onto my server. Hang on, just got to kick somebody off here. This is what happens when you delegate. See? Now I've got this as my ammunition. Any other questions?
Can you relate what does it add to the SCCM process?
It gives you more features in the task sequence, for one thing. If I can bring, yeah, here it is. If when I bring this up, I'll show you. I'm going to duplicate the screen so that you can see it here. Okay. We got that? No? Yes. Okay, good. This is a task sequence that we're using right now. You can see all of the stuff that's in here, right? So this is all our software. This actually isn't the full one. There's a bigger one. With the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, there's a whole bunch of things you can use, right? These are things that aren't there if you don't have MDT. So things like configure a DNS server, DHCP, install updates offline is very handy, because if you want to patch a machine, it allows it to not be connected to the network and installing the updates. There's all kinds of things in here, but beyond that, what it does is in the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, there are a ton of scripts that Microsoft has created for unattended functions during a software deployment or an OS deployment, and you have access to all of those as well. So some of those scripts are very handy. They query the registry, they query the WMI, they fill out fields, they allow you to use multiple variables to make decisions in the task sequence. And if you really want to, you can create your own MDT database. And what that database would do is you could populate it with machine names. And in the task sequence, you could have groups of software. So you could have like an HR machine. All those machines are in the database. And when the task sequence hits one of those machines, it'll install a specific package of software just for HR machines. It really allows you to do a lot. On the other hand, it doesn't take away anything. So by installing it, we don't lose anything, like it doesn't change anything, none of this looks any different. But there are a lot of things that it adds to it. So this is what a task sequence looks like, and I'm just gonna go really quickly let's go to, let's pick one. These are some of the task sequences that I have. That's for me, I'm busy. Yeah, so here's a good example of what we can do with the variables. So on a collection, and I'll really quickly show you what the collections look like. These collections, and I've got a whole pile of them as you can see. Under Adobe Pro, I can do something like assign a variable. So this is a collection of machines. These machines are supposed to get Adobe Pro. This is populated based on a group in Active Directory. So we create a group, we call it Adobe Pro, we put machines in the group. Those machines automatically show up in the collection because the collection is designed to query the group, and any machines that are in it show up in the collection, right? And this is all automatic. Once it's set up, I don't need to maintain it, it does it automatically. So I've got all these machines. I then put a variable on the collection. The variable is called Pro, and it's got a value of true. Then I've got a reader collection. And this, I have a variable called reader equals true. Pretty straightforward. Now you can have lots of these variables, by the way. You can define 20 of them per collection, then give them a priority. So I've got pro equals true, reader equals true. Then, within the task sequence, I can set it up, and I'm pretty sure this is the one, so that this step only runs, and this is the reader install step, only runs if there's a variable called reader and it equals true. This means I can have one task sequence that installs Adobe Pro and Adobe Reader, but it'll only install the proper software on the proper machine. Those variables, by the way, carry forward. So if a machine is in that collection, it'll carry that variable no matter what other collections it's in, and a machine can be in as many collections as you want. So if I've got that machine in this collection, it's got a variable called reader and it equals true. If I put it in another collection with another variable, now it'll have 2 defined on it. And we can use that all across the board. So no matter what happens, I can create task sequences to utilize these variables. And they'll get used every single time. It doesn't matter what other collections the machine is in, as long as it's there, it'll work. Yeah?
How are you defining that?
In the collection itself. So it's in the collection properties. Yes, but as you add the machine to other collections, they will get other ones, but it will always maintain this. There is a way, by the way, I haven't written it yet. I'm trying to bring this up because we're actually using this quite a bit, of creating a query that'll show you all the variables on any given machine. Because that could be handy, right? You go to deploy software. What if I get pro and reader equals true on this thing somehow? It defeats the whole purpose, right? So in here, you just define the variable here. Give it a name, give it a value, and it'll carry that forward. Now this is really essential. In SCCM 2012, you cannot create sub-collections. As you might have noticed, I've got quite the directory tree going on here with collections, right? And I do that because if I advertise that Adobe task sequence to this collection, it encompasses the pro, the reader, they're all in there. I want it to only work on the machines that I've set it up for, right? I only want reader to go to reader and pro to go to pro. If I do it up here, it's going to go to all of them. And if none of those variables are true, nothing actually happens. So if it hits a machine where no variable is defined, it doesn't do anything. That means I can advertise it to everybody. And only the ones I want to have something happen will actually have something happen. But in SCCM 2012, you can't have subcollections. They don't support them, so you can't do a tree. What you can do is have a collection that contains all the other collections. And again, the variables hold true. So in that case, and 1 minute. Any questions while I bring up my 2012 server?
Do you investigate using the patch management tool?
Yeah, we have Secunia as well. Oh, I just gave them a plug. It's okay, they'll pay me later, I suppose. The security guys love it because it gives them reports that they really, really like, and they like the format and that kind of thing. But it integrates with 2012 anyway, so that's not a problem. There are several companies out there that make software that augment SCCM really, really well. For example, the reporting that I showed you, it's great, but a lot of it is just you read it and you go, this isn't what I wanted. So instead of having to build your own or go and figure out how to build your own, there are a lot of companies that make reporting enhancement software, and that doubles or quadruples the number of reports available. So, almost done?
When you went from the old way of, let's say, on the PCs to you see any concerns or see any issues?
No, the network hasn't been a concern. The only time that's going to be a concern for you is if you multicast. Multicasting tends to be pretty heavy on your network equipment. We do support multicast, but all of ours have been unicast so far. One quick note for anybody who's planning on doing multicast. If you know multicast, you know it's sort of like one big group hug, right? Everybody in and everybody out again, right? But if somebody misses the hug, they don't get the hug, right? Well, with SCCM 2012, actually with 2007 and 2012 on server 2008 or better, if you miss the hug, you can join it as it's in progress, and then when it's finished, what happens is it forms a unicast to that specific machine at the end to give it the bits it missed. So the 2012 and 2007 version of multicast, slightly different than the traditional one. It will work for stragglers. Yep. The thing is, we schedule them at night, weekends, 2 in the morning, nobody's there, network usage is low. And for the most part, I don't have to be there. You get it down, you run these task sequences, ultimately they start working. You may have 1 or 2 in the morning that like it rebooted and never came back. We have spares for that purpose. If it's dead, right, it rebooted and didn't come back, there's not much I can do about that. We are out of time.
Yeah, Cameron, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.